Thank you, Glinda. That was a very sweet introduction. I deeply appreciate it, just as I admire what you've been able to build in 5 years. In 5 years, you've created something bigger than the Institute, which has taken 60 years to create. So we definitely appreciate that. And it's a pleasure to talk a little bit in this context about a book that's still on my desk but will be published in October on Leonardo da Vinci, because it's about the brain. I've always written about very brainy people, whether it's when I wrote Ben Franklin and then Albert Einstein, had done Henry Kissinger. After that, Steve Jobs said, well, why don't you do me next? I said, yes, Franklin, Einstein, then you. It's a logical sequence, but... and then I realized that the essence of being a real genius, somebody had a real fingertip feel for the beauties and patterns of this world, was not just a great brain and great intellect, but great creativity and great imagination. And the ability to connect the arts and the sciences, to connect the humanities and technology. And to me, the icon, the Mount Everest of that, was Steve Jobs' hero. He told me I had to write about him. Bill Gates, who had bought the notebooks, the Codex Leicester, and so many others said, it's Leonardo da Vinci that really explains how a smart brain becomes a creative brain. And to me, we know that smart people are a dime a dozen. What we're looking for is those who can make the leap and become creative people as well. When Leonardo was reaching that very terrifying milestone of turning 30 years old, some of us remember that, he decided to leave Florence, which is where he had spent the early part of his life, where he had become a moderately good painter, but was known for not finishing his commissions. Any of us who have children know what it's like to have somebody who is talented but doesn't really buckle down and finish all of the commissions. So he wrote a letter to the ruler of Milan. And it was a short letter. It was only 11 paragraphs. And in the first 10 paragraphs, Leonardo da Vinci described all the different things he could do as a great engineer and military engineer and scientist. One paragraph talks about diverting the flows of water because that was so important in Milan. Another is talking about tanks and various flying devices and machinery that could win wars. He talked about building roads. He talked about building locks. He talked about all the things that he could do as an engineer and some of the amazing things he could do as a scientist. It was only in the 11th paragraph that he says, I can also paint and sculpt as well as any person. Now, of course, he could. When he gets to Milan, he paints the Last Supper, probably one of the most deep and complex and beautiful pictures in the history of art. And then the greatest of all paintings in the history of art, the Mona Lisa. But in his own mind, he was not just an artist, nor did he make a distinction between his art and science. When he goes to Milan, he does his anatomy experiments, he dissects cadavers, dissects the face. He also does his engineering and tries to build various flying machines. He also, and this is underreported, becomes a theatrical impresario. At the court of Milan, the Duke of Milan, they didn't have movies, they didn't have television, and in the evenings they'd have events like this, that were intellectual discourses, and they'd have pageants and plays. And Leonardo was the impresario for the Duke of Milan. So a lot of those devices you see, including the thing that people say is the original helicopter, that sort of aerial scoop, that was actually done for a pageant on stage at the castle in Milan. But what he is doing is combining fantasy with engineering. He's combining imagination with technology. And in short, he's doing what we try to do in this new day and age. Because Florence and Milan were very similar to our current age. with Gutenberg having invented the printing press or the movable type press, and all these new sources of information coming in, Columbus having initiated an age of discovery. It was a time when all sorts of different and diverse groups of people were flowing together in places like Florence and Milan, starting a thriving middle class in which artisans became artists and architects, and they mixed everything together. And that was the source, this diversity, of the creativity you found in that town, or in those towns, Milan and Florence. But it was also the source of Leonardo's creativity, because he had such a diverse set of interests. And one of the things that first disappointed me when I went through Leonardo's notebooks was all the projects he didn't quite finish. Adoration of the Magi, he's painting it when he's leaving Florence, leaves it unfinished. But still, it's a beautiful swirl in which the energy of swirls that he found in nature are there in the underdrawing for that painting. But all the machines he didn't make, some of the things that were verging on fantasy. And it took me a while to realize that was the source of his strength, the ability to fantasize things, the ability to try things out and then move on, not a source of his weakness. And so I tried to drill down into what was the essence of Leonardo's creativity. Now, one thing about Leonardo is that he wasn't necessarily the smartest person at that time, meaning smart in terms of just pure mental processing power. I had seen this before when I was writing about the founders and Benjamin Franklin. I realized Benjamin Franklin was an absolute genius and just indispensable to holding our nation together with the founding and that team of founders that they had. But he wasn't the smartest one. Madison, Jefferson, so many others had an intellectual depth that Franklin didn't have. But Franklin had the ability to connect science and philosophy and diplomacy and balance of powers. And he was a glue that brought together ideas and brought together people. And that's why he was indispensable. Likewise, Steve Jobs, I do not think, had as much pure mental processing power as a Bill Gates. Bill Gates was just is an unbelievable processor of information, one of the sharpest minds I've ever seen. But Bill Gates built the Zune. You know, Steve built the iPod and the iPhone. Why? Because Steve was able to connect design, which he got from the design conference on this campus, and beauty to technology. He realized that beauty mattered, and that if you saw the beauty of the patterns of the universe and connected it to our devices, there would be a harmony. It was an intuitive thing. And with all due respect to Bill Gates, you don't remember the Zune, most of you, but if you look at it, it looks like it was built in Kazakhstan or Siberia. And I'm sure it had slightly better circuits or maybe even better code, although Microsoft wasn't known for elegant coding. But it didn't have that intuitive thing that a genius would bring to the party. The ultimate symbol of that genius is Leonardo's great drawing, known as Vitruvian Man. You know, the nude guy doing the jumping jacks in the square and the circle. By the way, that's a self-portrait. That's Leonardo in the square and the circle. He was very good looking, very good shape, very athletic, beautiful golden curls, and wasn't exactly the most humble artist at the time, so he liked to do self-portraits. Bottom of Adoration of the Magi, you see another picture of him, etc. But what that picture shows is man in harmony with the cosmos and the earth and his own body, and that connection of art and science. I went to go see it at the Academy in Venice, and I said to somebody, do you think he did it as a work of art, or did he do it as a work of science? Because it does every proportion of the human man is on the notebook pages next to it. And the curator looked at me, I knew it was a dumb question as soon as I asked, but looked at me somewhat appalled and said, I do not think Leonardo would have made such a distinction. And so that's what we have to do in life if we're going to be creative across disciplines. That got me to the key to Leonardo. There were greater geniuses, as I said, in a very specific mental processing power definition of that word at the time. Leonardo in his notebooks makes simple arithmetic mistakes at times. He's not very good at equations. And there's people like Luca Pacioli, his very close friend, who's totally amazing at mathematics and drilling down. Leonardo was born out of wedlock, which was a good fortune for him because he never went to school. But he had to become a disciple of experiences, he said. So he didn't have a lot of book learning, but taught himself things. So all of these things make it so that he's not the most informed or even the greatest mental processing power intellect of his time, but it helps him become the greatest genius in all of history. Why? First of all, because he believes in experience. He tests everything out. Somebody says, why does the dragonfly wing does this? He goes down to the moats and studies various dragonfly wings until he finds out. He doesn't believe just in relying on the wisdom that's received from the ancients. Secondly, and his most important trait, and this is the one I love because it's one we can emulate in ourselves, is pure curiosity. He was the most insatiably curious man in history. And every week, he made a list of random things he was curious about and he was going to find out about. And those lists are almost a parody. You can't believe them as you read them. But in my book on Leonardo, I go all through the notebooks and look at the list. And some are very practical, like, take the measurements of every street in Milan, and the next is draw Milan. But the next will be something like, why is the sky blue? Now, you don't need that to paint Virgin of the Rocks or whatever. In fact, we looked outside today. Every one of us said, wow, nice day. Look how blue the sky is. And probably very few people in this room decided to pause and think about and maybe research exactly why is it blue as opposed to pink or red or any other color. But Leonardo asked himself. When I saw that in the notebook, I went, oh, wow, because Einstein had it in his notebook. Every great thinker has paused and looked at the mundane things that you and I see every day but don't question. And whether it was Leonardo, who does figure it out, that it's a scattering of rays of light by water vapor, or much later Einstein, who figures out the exact way that at the subatomic level, the scattering of Maxwell's equations causes this, or Lord Rayleigh, who before Einstein figured out why the blue spectrum is diffracted differently. All of these great geniuses are curious. And they're just curious for sometimes because it's useful, but sometimes for pure curiosity about random things. So over and over in that notebook, it's described the placenta of the calf. Blow up the intestines of a pig to see if they expand or elongate when you pump air into them. Describe the tongue of the woodpecker is on one of them. Well, wait a minute. Why would you care, but how would you even know what a tongue, what do you do? Catch a wood, There it was, describe the tongue of the woodpecker. Show how locks work in Milan. Show how fossils got to the top of mountains. And you see it in his paintings. Every one of his paintings has a river running through it with all the fossils done correctly. But that's not why he wanted to know. He wanted to know because he was Leonardo. He was curious. He disproves the notion of the biblical flood at a time when it was heretical. But he writes about it. He says, no, couldn't have happened with the flood. Some of these animals were alive when they're there. You can see the trace fossils. He studies them. He is asking himself out of pure curiosity about everything. Second, other wonderful trait he has that we can emulate, and this is the point of my talk here, which is we can't emulate the real, absolute, smartest people that ever existed. There's no way you're going to be like Einstein, even if you read my book on Einstein. Einstein was endowed with a certain mind that we're not going to be able to replicate. Same with Newton, same with some of the others. But Leonardo, trust me, you do math better than he did, but he had that curiosity that can make our brain cross disciplines. And the second thing he had was just a power of observation. I almost use the word that Kenneth Clark used, which is superhuman power of observation. He could look at a bird's wing and he'd discover or find out and write in his notebook which birds raise their wing faster and which wings lowered them faster when they flap. And Kenneth Clark, when he looks at all the things that Leonardo goes and observes, calls it superhuman. That's the same mistake that his first biographer, Vasari, in the 1500s made, saying that he was touched by God, it was superhuman. It wasn't superhuman. It was just that he took the time, he took the care to say, I'm going to sit with my notebook and look at birds and figure out which ones flap their wings in different ways. I'm going to see what their tail does when they land. I'm going to look at how water moves around the curve of a bed of a river and what causes it to swirl and what causes the swirls to move and what causes the swirls to stop. Very first painting he does with Verrocchio, his teacher, is the Baptism of Christ, one of the greatest paintings in the history, mainly because Leonardo does the entire background and the water, as well as the two angels that are so beautiful. But as the water finally comes down from the heart of the cosmos into the earth, through the human picture, down through the cup of John the Baptist, and then swirls around his feet, you see every ripple and every swirl done scientifically, beautifully. To the end of his life, Leonardo is doing deluge drawings of swirls of water. But he's doing it not just because he needs it for his art. He's doing it because why water swirls fascinates him. He observes it. Now, you and I observe water swirling every day. You've done it already this morning. You turned on your sink, the water came in, there were bubbles, it swirled, and you did not look at it carefully. But every day, Leonardo looked carefully at why water swirls. And that's my point. It was not a superhuman ability to observe. It was just a desire and a will and an effort to look at everything. How light hits. I've tried to do this now because he did so many drawings on this. But how this light is hitting my shirt and how the curve. What happens to the shadows? What happens to refracted light? This is a glint, a little piece of luster where you see the bright spot. What happens when it hits a shadow? He spent dozens of notebook pages just observing that. Partly because it helped his art, but partly because it satisfied his curiosity. And I'll end by saying, by having those traits, he was able to cross disciplines. Euler was better in math, and so was Pacioli. And there were people who were doing anatomy studies that were probably better. But he connected across disciplines. When he dissected the face of 30 human cadavers and had every muscle and every nerve and exactly how the eye perceived light and had it marked in his notebooks, that's when he started drawing on the side of those anatomy pages the Mona Lisa smile, the smile that flickers, that if you look at it directly is not a smile, but if it comes in through a different part of your retina, pops up, because he knows how shadows hit your retina differently than details hit your retina. All of these things he did by connecting his art to his science. And so even as others were doing perhaps as good anatomical drawings or as good engineering or as good mathematics, none were doing it while painting the Mona Lisa, painting the Last Supper, doing the wonderful drawings that connected the earth to the cosmos, to the humans, or for that matter, building flying machines and designing waterways and new castles and new ways to do utopian cities. His ability to cross disciplines, to take a pattern he finds in nature, like the swirl, and to make it a piece of art, to find a pattern that he discovers in mathematics and to turn it into a piece of engineering or a flying machine. He was probably the person in history who most tried to know everything there was to know about everything that at the time could possibly be known. And by doing that, he has an intuitive feel for the beauty and the patterns of nature. At the end, I decided, okay, I'll never be Leonardo. I'll never paint the Mona Lisa. But every time I see a piece of light hitting my shirt, I'm going to remember the drapery drawings that some of you may know, the wonderful things he did, the black and white drawings that just show exactly how shadows hit a piece of cloth. And when I walk down past the river, I'm going to look at the swirls and figure out what the bubbles do with the swirls and why the bubbles are there and how they slow the swirls. And I'm going to try every day to just be a little bit more observant and a little bit more curious. Because in the end, the flexible mind, the mind that's creative, the mind that's imaginative, is the one that is always observing, always curious, and always indulging fantasy the way he did. This is something we can preserve in ourselves, because usually it gets knocked out of us at ideas festivals, if not at brain labs. But most of all, we can nurture it in our children. Just keep asking those questions. When they stop asking, why is the sky blue, and they seem to have graduated from their wonder years, make sure they hold on to their wonder years. And when they indulge in fantasy, don't say, quit daydreaming. Say, wow, that's cool. Draw it for me. Show me. Tell me the tale behind it, whatever it may be. And I'll end with this slight coda. I'll tell you something you don't know. The tongue of a woodpecker is 3 times longer than its beak. And it wraps around the back of the brain and down into the nostrils, so that when a woodpecker hits a piece of bark at 10 times the speed that would kill a human, the tongue and its supporting set shelters it, nurtures it, allows it to be okay. This is something you do not need to know. It has absolutely no utility in your life. It had absolutely no utility for Leonardo's life. Didn't help him paint birds or create flying machines. But I thought that maybe, after considering the way Leonardo thought, that you, just like Leonardo, would want to know about the tongue of the woodpecker. Thank you all very much.